Genealogy Standards and the Biographies of A.L. Heermann. This is another JDW talk. My targeted audience here are genealogists, especially those interested in difficult things to solve, ornithologists, historians, birders, and California naturalists. I have a paper describing how I revised this person's birth and death information. I also have a link to a small pocket website that tells you a little bit more about me. My goals here are to show some of Adolphus Heermann's accomplishments, use family history tools to overcome limitations of previous biographers, revise his birth date and place, and revise his death date as well. So here is a 1928 paper discussing the people whose names appear in the nomenclature, the naming of California birds. And it says that Dr. Adolphus L. Heermann was born in South Carolina about 1818, died near San Antonio, Texas, September 2nd, 1865, from the effects of an accidental discharge of his gun. Dr. Heermann was one of the most active collectors that visited the state in the early days. He made 2 trips to California, one about 1849 to 52. That was during the gold rush, and he wasn't interested in gold. He was interested in collecting specimens. And the other as surgeon and naturalist of one of the Pacific Railroad surveys in 1853 to 54. Well, that's mostly accurate, except for he wasn't born in South Carolina. He was born in Louisiana. Wasn't born in 1818. He was born in 1821. And he didn't die on September 2nd. He died on September 27th. And I'll show you how we arrive at that with a lot of work. In 1849 to 52, he came out here. He was based in Sacramento, and he went up and down the state collecting various natural history items, especially birds. He returned to Philadelphia with 1,200 bird skins, nests, and eggs. It wasn't a simple matter. He had to ship his collection by a sailing ship down the coast all the way to Panama. It was then brought overland. There was obviously no canal then. And on the other side, in the Gulf of Mexico, he loaded them again on a ship and eventually went to Philadelphia, which at that time was the center of the science in the United States. He was very well known. Here is someone who was naming new species from California based upon Heermann's collection. And he says, through his zeal and liberality, the museum of our institution has been greatly enriched in the departments of ornithology, mammalogy, mineralogy, and herpetology, thus presenting a useful and honorable example of leisure and wealth. He was a pretty wealthy person, devoted to the noblest of human pursuits, the study of the phenomena and laws of the material universe. The Pacific Railroad surveys in 1853 to 54, the government was trying to figure out a railroad route to the Pacific so that they can bring in stuff into California. Adolphus was the doctor in one of the surveys. It produced large amounts of information, lots of volumes, lots of specimens to the Smithsonian Institute. And it was called the richest store of information then available on the natural history of the American West. And so here is, he started in San Francisco on this survey with Lieutenant Williamson. And a lot of the freeways that we drive on today were actually mapped initially by this survey. You can see all and of course he did this all on horseback, a big expedition. His legacy is that he found 65 new species to science, or subspecies as well. He found a lot more than that, but a lot of them were previously known, and that was found out later. There are a number of species that honor him with their name. That's called an eponym, a species name that honors a person, usually in the first collector. I have a species myself that's named after me. Of course, it's a mite. It's really small, but hey, you know, a species is a species, and I was there when it was collected in the tundra. There are 10 species, subspecies with Hermanni in the scientific name, and he collected the first voucher specimen for most of them. That includes 4 plant species, 2 fossil mollusks, a scallop and an oyster. And if you saw my welcome video, I show you a Heermann's oyster fossil from about 6 to 8 million years ago. 2 birds, one of them Heermann's gull, and the other one is a subspecies of song sparrow. And then we have Heermann's kangaroo rat. And here's my picture of Heermann's gull. It's a very handsome looking bird. So let me show you how I go about finding how he was born. Genealogists use census research extensively, and we can find A.L. Heermann on the Texas 1860 census sheet for San Antonio. And here he is, A.L. Heermann. Its brother Theodore, T, is right below him. He's older than Theodore. He's 39. Theodore is 37. We see they're both physicians. They actually own ranches there. And they both are born in Louisiana. Now, census research, you're not absolutely sure that you're dealing with reality there. They might have gotten the information from someone else. So if you're doing genealogy, you want something else. So I then found that a bunch of volunteers in New Orleans had transcribed the birth records and put them on an index. And so when I looked at this, I could see that and I'm showing you all the columns and bringing them together, that Lewis and Eliza Potts, that's her maiden name, had 5 sons. And Adolphus, you can see here, is the oldest son. So Adolphus Louis Heermann must have something that they indexed on. So I sent away to the archives, and out came his birth certificate. Now, I might point out that none of the other biographers had ever seen this. And on the back, you can see I got a certified true copy of it. This is what's called a delayed birth certificate. And I think they did this when they went to Europe and got a permit to do that, a passport. They didn't need a passport in those days. And it says here, it was registered at the birth of Adolphus Louis Heermann, born in the city of New Orleans on the 21st day of October, and the year of our Lord 1821, during the lawful marriage of the late Mr. Louis Heermann and Eliza Potts, his wife. So that Louis had died when Adolphus was about 13, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There was a strong legal aspect as to inheritance of estate, and the inheritance went from one male to another, the father to the oldest son, etc. And that may play a role in this story. So They're establishing a lawful legal marriage, mainly for these sorts of legal matters. The father, Louis Heermann, was actually a well-known surgeon in the Navy. When he died, the estate went into probate. There were 593 pages. It's all online at Family Search, and it's free. I can see that the estate was worth $200,000, which is equivalent to close to $6 million in 2012. And the probate is filled with bills. So I could trace Adolphus's missing years based upon the money that went out to pay for his education, for his transportation, and for other things as well. Probate is really an interesting document. I see in the document here that there are 5 sons. This is in the probate document. Adolphus Heermann is the oldest son. He was born first, and it shows that he was born in New Orleans in October of 1821. His brother, Theodore, is the next in age, and those two stuck together for most of their life. The third one, Valentine, was the only one who stayed in New Orleans and took care of the family business in New Orleans. We have 2 more sons as well. I also found online that the family had applied for passport applications. They didn't really need it, but it was probably good when they went to Europe. And so here we have Adolphus Heermann, again born in Louisiana in October 1821. Talks about his features there. We also have his brother Theodore. So I think I have established here with a set of different documents that Adolphus was born in New Orleans on October 21st, 1821, and he was the oldest of 5 sons. Now, there have been a number of papers written about this naturalist. The first one was by Witmer Stone. We'll look at that more in detail. Another one by Hume on ornithologists of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. And then another book of people whose name adorns various species. They did a little bit more work, and those are the Mearns. I think that's how you pronounce it, maybe not. Audubontisantis. And then there is Casto, and we'll talk a little bit about Casto as well. And the rest of the biographical material pretty much go back to those 4 sources. All of them, all published biographies of Adolphus, except Casto, have different birth information. Every single one of them, except for Casto. And Stanley, I found his paper. It's published in a Journal of the Southern Texas Archaeological Association. It's always hard to find. I had done most of my research before that. And what Casto did, Stan Casto, 1995, is he had access to family documents from brother Theodore, which is kind of neat. I tried to get those, to see those documents, was not successful. He used the 1860 Texas Federal Census, saw what I saw, thought that A.L. was the oldest of the 5 sons of Louis and Eliza, and then went on this article and said that it suggests that Adolphus was born about 1821 in New Orleans. He wrote to me after I had reached out to him that there were no online genealogical search services during the early 1990s when I, Stanley, was researching the life of A.L. Heermann, and some of my conclusions were the result of reasoning based on only a few hard facts. At least he had some facts. Thus, I feel vindicated that my suggestion that Adolphus was born in 1821 in New Orleans has been verified through your research. Now, genealogists have a way of determining what truth is, at least a process, and it's called the Genealogy Standards. The standards are: you need to conduct an exhaustive search, show accurate citations to sources, assess quality of evidence, resolve conflicts of evidence, and arrive at a reasoned conclusion. And these early biographers were limited in terms of how much they could search. Today, we have all sorts of indexes. We can do much better. But they made some fundamental errors. So let's look at Adolphus. Here he is. And that portrait that you just saw, and I'll show it to you again, was published along with an article by Witmer Stone, which is the first biography of Adolphus. And there is a note in the back about the picture. So let's look at the picture. The note says that this portrait is from a photograph of a daguerreotype type and represents the naturalist fitted out as he was on some Western expedition. Stone tried really hard to find a current photograph at the time, and he could not. This is the only one he could find. That it was not taken immediately upon his return is shown by the false beard, which has been added to heighten the effect. He's in costume. He's in costume. The photograph was kindly loaned by Mr. Lee Siner, the present proprietor of Kreider's gun store. Kreider was an associate of Adolphus. They collected together, and belonged to his father, John Siner, blah, 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 blah. Close friend of Heermann. So you're not going to shoot birds with that thing. And in fact, that's not from the California trip. It was from another trip as well. And in fact, if you look closely, you will see the false beard, the false hair, etc. What did he actually look like? That's not a person who's close to a millionaire, if not a millionaire. So Stan had this photograph, and actually, or at least this drawing, and I've actually found, I think, 2 more. And this is what he looked like. That's not the person. That's this wild man from the West. This paper by Witmer Stone is the major paper on up to that time and since. A lot of people use that. He was a curator of birds at the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences. And the famous sentence is that he says, "From estimates of 2 who knew him, I infer that he was born about 1818, probably in South Carolina." He didn't have any documentation for any of that. All he knew was oral history. And since Adolphus died in the 1860s, we're talking about memories of 40 years earlier. The review of this paper, of Mr. Stone's paper, said that Mr. Stone has been unable to present a very detailed or connected history of his life, of Heermann's life, but the facts he brought together are most welcome. A lot of people then quoted that. In 1942, Edgar Hume published a book on ornithologists of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. The people at the Smithsonian were putting educated biologists who were also doctors on various expeditions. That's how they got their specimens. And one of the people he looked at was Adolphus Heermann. And he says, details as to Heermann's life are meager indeed. His best biography is by the late Dr. Witmer Stone, but Stone did not know Heermann's full name, the names of his parents, the date of his birth, nor where and when he graduated in medicine. I have had the good fortune to clear up all of these questions, and it turns out he didn't, as you will see. What he did was he found a paper that was published in 1923 on Adolphus's father, Louis Heermann. Very prominent individual. A battleship was named the USS Heermann in World War II and actually had service there. So the family was prominent in New Orleans. In fact, Louis owned quite a bit of New Orleans downtown area. The paper continues by saying, for the Heermann family history, the authors acknowledge the help of the granddaughter of Louis, Mrs. E.B. Briggs, and I put down Ada Heermann. Well, how much can you trust oral history? Looking up census work, Ada is the daughter of Valentine. Remember, Valentine was the only son that remained behind to do the family estate. And Valentine is not in direct line with the inheritance. Adolphus died when Ada was probably 9. In 1923, when she helped these people, she would have been about 67 years old when she helped her grandfather's biographers. So we get all sorts of interesting tidbits here. We have something that Eliza and Louis got married on March 27th, 1821. However, contacting a family historian, I have a date of January 13th. The parents were well off. And there's Louis Heermann. I have a companion talk to this one. There's some fascinating stories. So Louis marries Eliza, hires John James Audubon to teach her painting, and fires John James Audubon, who's flirting with her, and she's pregnant with Adolphus at the same time. Some interesting stories about that. I can't check that. The marriage records were not registered civilly in New Orleans before 1831. However, if Adolphus was born October 21st, you can do the math and you can find out which one is probably more accurate. The January date is more accurate. There were 5 sons. That's fine. But Pleadwell and Kerr say that Adolphus was the youngest son. He was the 5th son. There's no information on birth dates or locations. And then we have this strange sentence that both Theodore and Adolphus died at San Antonio without issue, i.e. there was no heirs to the Heermann estate. That's wrong. You're looking at Theodore's son. Colorful sidelights on both Civil War and frontier life have been preserved from the career of his father, Dr. Theodore Heermann, prominent early Texan, by his son Felix, shown with old medical and hired handbooks. And that's what Casto had an opportunity to take a look at. In addition to that, that wasn't the only son that had male children. Another one did as well. So what does Hume conclude? He says that it's usually stated that Adolphus Heermann, the ornithologist, was born in South Carolina about 1818. But as his parents were married on 27th March 1821, and he was the 5th son, he could hardly have been born before 1827. That he may have been born in South Carolina, as the biographies state, is likely, as his father was stationed there about the estimated date of his birth. I can't find any mention in Pleadwell that Louis was in South Carolina. Now, I want to introduce you to a key figure here in Stone's paper. This person's name is Henry Dresser. He was 25 in 1863 when he met Adolphus, and he indicated Adolphus was about 50 years old and had a younger brother. And Stone quotes him, a younger brother. So he couldn't have been the youngest brother of the 5. And that poses a problem to Hume. So Hume says The date of his parents' marriage, 1821, and the ornithologist being a younger son, shows Dresser's opinion is incorrect. Moreover, Heermann was suffering from a serious and then incurable disease which may have aged him prematurely, and one cannot reconcile all statements as to dates in Heermann's life. That's what genealogists do. They are faced with conflicting information, and they want to reconcile all the statements. They want to find out what's true, what's not. And so, based upon Ada's comments in the 1923 paper, we get this idea that Adolphus is not the oldest son for a number of reasons. Genealogy without documentation is mythology, and there's no documentation here. How reliable is the evidence? The motivation of the informant that the only male descendant of Dr. Lewis Heermann is now living, which is her own son, but other two sons had male offspring. The effect of time to recall information. She indicates her father, Valentine, was an artist by profession, but the census shows he was a lawyer, broker, and farmer. There's obviously possibility of typographical errors on the paper. The authors may have misheard or miswrote her information. There's effect of time on her recollections. She may never have known the actual facts. And she may have twisted the information to highlight a part of the family. I do not know. The Mearns in 1992, it's a fascinating book. And when I went through it, I was looking for the person who was the weakest in terms of the story that was presented about their life. And that's why I picked Adolphus. They met that paradox about youngest son. And when they quote Stone, as you can see there, he and a younger, and they put down older in brackets right there. And that's wrong. So I think we've established the problems associated with establishing his birth. I was working with documents. I actually had his birth certificate, etc. Now, I didn't think I would have the same sorts of problems with the statistic of when he died. And all the previous biographies used Stone's 1906 article that Heermann died on September 2nd, 1865 in Bexar County, Texas. I've been told that's how you pronounce that. So it was some surprise when I was doing all this research to come to an index, this is an index, that showed one Adolphus Lennis Heermann, about the same age as the one I'm looking at, died on the 27th of September, 1865. Something's wrong there. So I went and got a certified copy of this death certificate. I think you can see Theodore Heermann's signature on the bottom. Valentine's also there. As you can see, it's a certified copy. And it happened that Theodore, in 1866, had a death certificate issued for his brother in New Orleans, showing A.L.'s death date of September 27, 1865. I think they did this for a number of reasons. One, because of a legal aspect of the estate. And so the death certificate says, be it remembered that on this day, the 27th of February, 1866, personally appeared Dr. Theodore Heermann, a native of New Orleans, even though he was now a resident of Texas, who by these presents declares that Dr. Adolphus Lewis Heermann, a native of New Orleans, again a resident of Texas, died on the 27th day of September, 1865, at 3:30 at Medina River, Bexar County, Texas. Deceased was unmarried. Again, the emphasis on who is the legal heir. And Valentine signs it, and so does Theodore. Well, let's get some independent ideas. So I find the probate papers. I write to the county clerk. I get a bunch of papers. I get a sworn statement from a neighbor. Neighbor says that Adolphus died on or about the 27th of September, 1865 in Bexar County. I saw him after he was dead, was present at his funeral, and saw him buried. Well, that's pretty definitive. So let's bring in Henry Eeles Dresser. He's an English ornithologist and industrialist. What he was doing in Texas was trying to make contracts with the Confederates, trying to get cotton into the mills in England. He lived with Adolphus in San Antonio for 2 years, 1863 and 1864. And Stone, actually in 1907, that's the paper now, 1906, like I said, used Dresser's 1906 letter, that was 40 years later after this event, throughout his paper. And I'll show you the problems of quoting. So the Mearns in 1992 said that, and this is their interpretation, at the end of July 1864, Dresser returned to England, taking with him many Texan bird skins. And my note is, including an Eskimo curlew given to him by Adolphus, and collections of eggs. Towards the end of the next year, he received a letter from Theodore Heermann, informing him that on 2 September, Adolphus had gone out alone to collect birds. Apparently, he had stumbled and fallen, and his gun going off had killed him. Hume quotes Stone, who's quoting Dresser. And this is supposed to be an exact quote. So, Dresser says, according to etc., I left San Antonio in August 1864 and returned to Europe. Later, I had a letter from Dr. Heermann's brother, that would be Theodore, stating that during his absence from the house, the doctor would go out alone, taking his gun to obtain some specimens of birds, and was found one day dead, having evidently stumbled and fallen, and his gun going off had killed him. This was on September 2nd, 1864. Hume continues, Heermann was of the same fiber from which so many hardy American pioneers have been built. His very picture shows this. This is the picture of Adolphus in costume. The Genealogy Standards has a number of warnings about quoting people. When quoting and transcribing, genealogists render wording, spelling, numbering, abbreviations, superscripts, and similar features exactly as they appear in the original. Genealogists' selections of quotations do not alter the original writer's meaning. Although this is word for word, Hume is misquoting Stone. Although this is word for word, Hume is misquoting Stone. And I will show you that in a second. So let's see if we understand that. Theodore here, in 1865, writes a letter to Dresser. And Dresser, 40 years later in 1906, refers the same information to Stone. So I communicate with Henry McGee. We had a nice conversation, nice email communication. He is the Dresser archivist. Dresser had a very large collection of specimens. They were all put into the University of Manchester. And Henry says to me that the letter doesn't exist from Theodore. Darn. But Henry tells me that he knows that there is a letter from Dresser to a person by the name of Alfred Newton. Now, Adolphus sent a whole collection of eggs from Texas to Newton, who is an ornithologist, And so everybody's corresponding with each other, and Dresser was corresponding with this professor as well. And Henry tells me exactly where that letter is, that Dresser wrote to Newton about Adolphus's death. So I get the letter. The letter says, from Dresser, I have just received a long letter from Captain and Dr. Theodore Heermann, in which he says as follows, that he, Adolphus, died at our place near San Antonio on the 27th September last at 3:30 p.m. Your letter to him, that of 27th August being the last, duly reached their destination and remained unanswered by him, because he had for some time previous to the said event ceased to write anywhere. In other words, he was in bad shape. I don't see him going out collecting. Preparations were being made for my brother and myself to go to New Orleans, when it pleased God to call him to a better world. I also started searching, and I found out that everybody seemed to be corresponding with George Boardman, who had a large collection of birds in the United States. And the Smithsonian Institution had an archive of these letters, and so I corresponded with them, found out they had some letters. They had a whole bunch of letters, and they said you can photocopy them, get them photocopied. So I paid money to photocopy the whole group. Fascinating. The letters are fascinating. And Tad, this is from his email. I've never seen anything like this. Tad tells me that many of the letters are tedious to read. The Dresser correspondence in particular, as he often wrote both vertically and horizontally across the page. I'll show you what that looks like. Furthermore, much of the original correspondence was composed of very thin paper, which had a tendency to bleed through one side of a page. I assure you considerable effort was exerted to produce high-quality copies. Must have been really cheap to avoid postage to write a letter like that. Here's a letter where he writes 2 pages on one. I'm surprised he didn't figure out how to write it diagonally. Took a while to look through some of those, but I found what I was looking for, which is that Dresser wrote Boardman, I have just received some sad news from Texas. Poor Dr. Heermann died on the 27th September at 3:30 p.m., as I see from a long letter from his brother Theodore, who was with him to the last. Didn't die in the field. So what we have established is that Theodore did indeed tell Dresser September 27th. The question is, what did Dresser tell Stone? And it turns out that that letter is in existence at the Academy of Natural Science of Philadelphia. In fact, their bylaws of that said that they would never throw away anything. They kept everything, and they photocopied it. Here's the letter. So I correspond with the Academy archives, and as you see, Stone in his paper say, I quote from the letter which he, Dresser, kindly wrote me on the date of March 28, 1906, when I asked him for any information he might possess relative to Dr. Heermann. Well, it's not only the letter, here's the letter from 28 March 1906, but he then sent a postcard, which is also in the archives. And the postcard says the following. I hunted amongst old papers for any letters of his, Adolphus's, but found that I have not kept any. I see, however, that our correspondence ceased in July 1865, not in 1864, nearly a year after my return to Europe, so he must have been alive then. Dresser has no idea when Adolphus died. He has no idea. Okay. That means that Stone came up with that number by himself. And all these biographies are wrong. Now, let me show you why there's a misquote by Hume. Bring in Hume. See where the quote marks end in that paragraph? The quote marks end before Stone says, "This was on September 2nd, 1865. Hume is misquoting Stone. Now, it's possible that that's a typo. In other words, he meant to type September 27th, although he didn't have that. Where did he get that information anyway? So let me show you where he got the information from. And let me propose where the September 2nd came from. In the proceedings of the Academy in 1866, the following deaths were announced. Adolphus's death was announced as September 2nd, 1865. That's where he got it. The solution to this problem is at the basement of the Pollock Library at California State University at Fullerton. So I went there, went down to the basement, went to an area where all the microfilm was, which no one uses. And in fact, during the couple hours I spent here, I don't think I saw a single person interrupt me. And the Academy of Natural Sciences has microfilmed everything, every scrap of paper they ever had. So I picked up the films I was interested in, including the membership cards and the minutes from the area that I was interested in. And I have an expertise in microfilming, photographing microfilms. And I do that for my census research projects. And so I can actually get images off the microfilm. Nobody bothered me. Brought in my own little devices. That's a little small Olympus 50-50 camera. Found the pages where the membership pages. Here's Adolphus L. Heermann, MD. John Casson was one of the ones who proposed him. Casson named Heermann's Gull in honor of Adolphus. And when did he die? He died on, click through, he died on September 27th. It's on the card. Okay, let's look at the minutes. 1866, January 2nd. Remember, this is when they announced his death. And I look down at the bottom, and there's something strange. Underneath Adolphus L. Heermann is a glued-on strip of paper. And the glued-on piece of paper obscures the 7. So maybe someone might have thought that was a comma. Now, here is the actual draft of the minutes. Remember, they didn't throw out anything. And if you look at the draft of the meeting, on the bottom, you will see that the 27th of September is when the death was announced. So I asked the archivist there whether they could, it's falling apart anyway, whether they could look underneath that piece of paper what was there. And it turns out that there's the meetings on the left, and then on the right you see business being called up by special resolution, blah, blah, blah. In other words, they went from a regular meeting to a business meeting, and what is being obscured is an incorrect statement. That what's underneath that is that, quote, the rough minutes having been read, the Academy then adjourned. But they didn't adjourn. Instead of just putting a line through it, they glued a piece of paper over it. That's what I think happened. So in order to complete this circle, I submitted this paper to Cassinia. It was accepted. And there is the updating the life and death of A.L. Human. I just gave you a link to that. I put on my Dropbox. And my last paragraph is this on my paper, that what I did was necessary to resolve conflicts in the existing biographical information. There are more tools today that help find such documents than were available in the past. Biographers honor their subjects by presenting information that is as accurate as possible. Thus, I honor naturalist Adolphus Louis Heermann, who was born on October 21st, 1821, in New Orleans, Louisiana, and died at the age of 44 on September 27, 1865, in Bexar County, Texas. I acknowledge a lot of people. Most of these are archivists. Lots of biographical sources, contacted lots of different archives. Lots of work went into that. I have a companion talk that I'm going to put online on the life of the naturalist Adolphus L. Heermann. Discusses the missing years and his collecting life. And with that, I will tell you that I have a bunch of PowerPoint presentations I'm putting up on YouTube from JDW Talks, and some of them may be of interest. These talks may be of interest to you if you're genealogists or interested in the 1950 census, or I have some bird talks that I'm going to put up there as well. So thank you for your attention, and I appreciate you can tell other people about this video. Thank you.